What's up guys, my name is Marc Steiner, and today we are going to be talking about making the switch to Sony. Now as many of you know, I've been a Sony shooter for a little over a year now, and I haven't really talked about where I was coming from and what made me switch. I was coming from Nikon, that's right, I was using a Nikon D3300 and that was my go-to camera for everything, and I absolutely loved that camera. But I knew pretty early on after I started getting into photography that I really enjoyed this and that I was going to be making the jump to full frame sometime in the future. And so because of that, I started looking at the options there were at the time. And so there was the 5D Mark IV, there was the Nikon D800, and there's the Sony A7R II. And I was a huge proponent of the bleeding edge of tech. I've always been that tech nerd that absolutely loves all the craziest stuff that you can get. And for me, Sony just made sense because they had all this tech. But I was a little bit apprehensive about purchasing a Sony at the time because it just, even though it was the bleeding edge of technology, it wasn't quite up to par in a professional setting. Let me explain, because a lot of these are still perceptions that people have that just aren't true anymore. So at the time, the A7R II, the flagship camera that Sony had, it was a great camera, high megapixels, beautiful image quality, but the focusing system was a little bit unreliable. Eye autofocus wasn't quite where it was today, and overall, it just wasn't a professional camera. It only had one SD card slot, so you couldn't shoot redundantly, which is a huge deal breaker for wedding photographers. You were limited to 5 frames per second shooting in photo mode, which was also a deal breaker for me shooting sports and weddings. But probably the biggest deterrent for me at the time was the battery life. The battery life just wasn't up to par with anything else on the market, and you would have to have 5 to 8 batteries just to compete with one DSLR battery, and for me that was just a huge deal breaker. And when you're investing $2,000 to $4,000 in a big purchase like a full frame camera, you want to know that you're getting the best possible thing that you're gonna love and you're not gonna have any regrets about. So I started doing more research, and Nikon and Canon, they were both great for photos. Canon was definitely better for video because of that continuous autofocus and they had those nice colors, but for me they just felt like they were crippling their cameras even back then, to the point where I knew that it wasn't going to be suitable 5 years down the road, whereas Sony was making sure that their cameras were future-proof and they kept updating them, and I knew that this is something that I really wanted. I was also really interested in Sony because of the fact that it was a mirrorless camera. I, being the tech nerd that I was, knew that the future of camera technology was mirrorless, and I wanted to jump on that train before it was cool to know that I was going to be future-proof down the line, because I knew that DSLRs were not going to be around for much longer. And because it was mirrorless, that's why Sony was able to do so much with this camera. Eye autofocus, that was unheard of. That was just mind-blowing to me, and since I'm mostly a portrait photographer, that was a huge drawing point for me. The fact that it had an EVF as well, that you could see your final image before you even took the photo, that was incredible, and you never needed to chimp to see if your exposure was right. You knew right off the bat whether or not the photo was the right photo. So even with all these features and whatnot, I was still very drawn towards Sony, knowing that this is going to be the future of camera technology. So naturally, I decided to rent a Sony A7R II for an engagement shoot of my friends Maddie and Nathan, and I loved it. I had a very good time with it, but I could also see where the drawbacks were on this camera. The image quality was absolutely insane, but again, with the A7R II, the eye autofocus wasn't quite where it was today, so I was a little bit apprehensive, especially on moving subjects. File sizes were massive. Oh my god, when you're shooting at 42 megapixels, when you're making that jump from 24, the file sizes are absolutely huge, and they're going to take up so much space on an SD card, they're going to take so much space up on your hard drive, and they're going to have a much more difficult time being edited in Lightroom and Photoshop because of these massive file sizes. And the camera felt a little bit small in my hands without a battery grip, so I added that to my list of things that I wanted on this camera because I knew it would make my life easier and it would just feel much better in my hand. But I absolutely loved what I was able to capture with the Sony A7R II, and I was like, this is a good start to this camera, but I think I'm going to wait until the next generation. So I started looking at all the rumor sites and when Sony was going to be announcing the next gen camera, and lo and behold, they announced the Sony A7R III in November of 2017, and I was one of the first people to pre-order it, and I was one of the first people in the world to get a brand new Sony A7R III at the very beginning of December, and that was super fun. This was my perfect camera. It had all the video functions I wanted. It had 4K, it had slow motion at 120 frames per second, it had log profiles, it had HLG, and the fact that it had all of this in a small compact body And now for the first time it had dual SD card slots, it had a much better battery that was as good or better than any DSLR on the market, so I was much more confident. The autofocus was vastly improved, as well as the eye autofocus, which makes my life a lot easier and super helpful. The EVF was also even better, higher resolution, 3-point-something million dots, and that was just a beauty to look through every single time when you were using this camera. You're like, wow, I'm seeing this photo before it's even taken in full glorious resolution, and I know I'm getting the right shot. It also had 10 frames per second, which made me feel very confident using it for weddings and action shots. And when you compare it to the competition of the Nikon D850 and the 5D Mark IV, it just blows it out of the water beyond compare. There was nothing that stacked up to this camera. Now, in 2019, Nikon and Canon have both released their own mirrorless cameras, and the fact that this camera came out over 2 years ago and it still stacks up to what they are releasing 2 years later just shows how good these cameras are, and it shows that Sony is really putting everything into these cameras. Sony is a company that is really listening to what their users want, and I'm sure that the 4th generation cameras are going to be even better and have everything we've asked for in a new camera. That's something that Nikon and Canon, more so Canon, are not doing with their customer base because they know that they're so deep in with their lens collection that they're not going to be switching over. So even though there are other mirrorless options on the market right now, I don't think that they hold a candle to Sony and what they're doing. And I find it so funny too that the things that Sony used to get all this crap for, like not enough lenses, bad battery life, not professional enough, are now all plaguing these 1st generation mirrorless cameras from Nikon and Canon. Only one SD card slot, not the best autofocus, no lenses whatsoever, and the very few lenses that they have are very expensive. People also used to say that Sony doesn't have any lenses, and that's just not true. They have the most flushed out mirrorless lineup of all the companies right now. And the fact that third-party lens manufacturers like Sigma have adapted all of their lenses to Sony E-mount just goes to show how big Sony has become and how popular it is. And I think the funniest one for me is the fact that everyone complains so much about the Sony menu systems. And to be fair, they are very long and complicated and could be organized a little bit better. But the main reason why so many people were complaining about the Sony menu systems is because there were so many options. And when you're coming from Canon or Nikon, you're like, oh, I don't want to deal with all these menu options. But the reason why these menu options were so vast is because you could customize your camera exactly how you want it to. You could customize every single button on a Sony camera, every single menu on the function menu, and you could even customize your own menu in the My Menu setting. You have so many options for customization on a Sony camera that you just couldn't get on a DSLR, and that for me was one of the big reasons why the menu system was so long, because you could customize everything. And now that Canon and Nikon are coming out with their mirrorless cameras, their menu settings have also gotten larger because there's more room for customization. So I just find it kind of funny that the people who are ragging on Sony for what they were doing are now being plagued with the same issues in their own cameras. For me, the transition from Nikon to Sony was a pretty easy one. I knew going in, switching from Nikon to Sony, there was going to be a learning curve, but I think for me it was more of a going from APS-C to full frame learning curve and less of a completely new ecosystem, because I knew that whatever I upgraded to, I was going to have to learn a brand new camera and have all these more professional features that you just didn't get on an entry-level body. So the switch for me was a relatively easy one because I knew that Sony was going to be the way to go down the road into the future, because they keep innovating at a level that Canon and Nikon just refuse to do. Do I think that you should switch to Sony? I genuinely do. I think Sony is the place to be right now, and I don't see Canon or Nikon overtaking them anytime soon, especially when they announce the A7R III and their 4th generation cameras down the line. Even if you are heavily invested in Canon or Nikon glass, there are adapters, and with the MC11, especially with a new firmware autofocus update coming to Sony cameras, you're going to be getting near native autofocus capabilities with any lens, so it's not a huge issue to be adapting lenses onto Sony. And if you're a hybrid shooter or even thinking about shooting video sometime down the road, Sony is the way to go because they are not crippling their cameras. Canon keeps crippling the hell out of their cameras, and Nikon is actually innovating very well with their cameras with external monitors, and I'm a huge fan of that. But I still think that Sony is doing the best out of all of them, and as they continue to innovate, it's only going to get better, and that gap is only going to get bigger and bigger. Alright guys, that's it from me. Let me know in the comment section down below what you thought about this video, if I was just ranting, if you think I'm a Sony fanboy. Let me know what you think. I would love to know what your thoughts on this are. Be sure to follow me on Instagram if you aren't already. I know that you will not regret it. My name has been Marc Steiner, and I will see you next time.